So, what if everything was Moses's fault? Hi, everyone. I am Ma Primzarine, and I like using my YouTube channel to really bust up ideas of who we think we are. Because I'm always talking about non-duality, and that's just literally what non-duality is. It is just using our mind to undo our mind by going through all the things that we believe we might be and going, no, I'm not that. No, I'm not that. And I find it very useful to work on the we because everything's united, right? Everything's interconnected. So if we can unravel the stories of who we think we are, then it's very easy to step into the actual being of who we are. And that's the purpose of non-duality. It's not to sit around and just constantly, argue about definitions of things. It's about really diving in and finding out who we are. So Moses, I assume everybody watching this video has heard of Moses, right? And the story of Moses. And when I talk about everything is Moses's fault, what I'm talking about is we can probably agree that something is going wrong and awry in today's world. Humanity seems kind of out of control, and lots of times people believe that it's human nature itself that is the problem. I am exploring the idea that it's not human nature that's the problem, it's the stories we believe and hold on to that are the problem. So Moses is a very, very old story. Or is it? Moses, in the grand geological scheme of things, wasn't that long ago. Moses, in the lineage of human ancestors, was not that long ago. Archaeological sites and scientists are telling us that human beings have been what we are like 100,000 years. We were just slightly different than what we are now for millions of years. You take this little slice of time that we consider to be human history, and it's just minuscule. It's a tiny slice. It's a tiny, 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 tiny slice in geological time, but it's just a tiny slice in the evolution of primates' time, particularly in the evolution of humans' time. So Moses, he wasn't that. If we change our story about Moses, the very first thing we see is he wasn't that long ago. One of the really interesting things to think about Moses is we have all sorts of written stories about Moses. That proves that Moses lived in a time when things were being written down. We tend to call human history, we start human history at the time when things were written down, but the slightest look at the actual timeline of human beings show that that can't be true. Things being written down has happened in this tiny little slice of history that you and I are living in, that we believe now is so important. So what did Moses do according to these stories we have? He was the one who first really started bringing in this idea of one God. We think, oh, that's such a great evolution from the pagans were so terrible and they were worshiping all these gods and fake idols. And Moses brought it all together in the idea of one God. We tend to confuse our modern sensibilities with these semi-ancient teachings. And we think that with what he meant by one God was some sort of universal unity. But it wasn't. It was one big God. That our God is the biggest God of all. Now we can admit that this has caused a lot of problems because one God, instead of saying there's one God that rules them all, Lord of the Rings, right? Instead of saying there's one God that rules them all, it's like, well, there's only one God. Which one is it? Well, it's obviously mine, and you're wrong, right? That's happened a lot. The slightest little education in history will let you know that that's true. That ever since the idea of one God came in, people have fought about God a whole lot more than they did before. Because back in the pagan world, like I come in, I travel across the savannah and I come over to your group of people that I'd never met before, and I have like 20 gods and you have like 10. I just add my gods to your gods. You add your gods to my gods, and we kind of get along. But ever since we started having the idea of one God, we haven't been able to get along. And that kind of doesn't make sense, does it? Because really, if there's one God, you call your God Allah, or you call your God God, or you call your God Zeus. If there's just one God, it's all the same God, right? But no, that's not how the human brain works. So why is the idea of one so divisive? Now we're back to non-duality, right? Non-duality says you can't really talk about unity because the human brain doesn't operate that way. Because the second we start talking about one, we project it outside of ourselves. There's one God. Now I've projected that idea outside of myself. There's me and there's God. So it doesn't matter whether or not we have my one God and your one God. It's still a projection. Doesn't matter whether or not it's like, well, my God is the unifying energy of all the universe. It's still a projection outside of yourself. There's still me here and God over there. So when you take the human brain and you put this deep, deep root of division in there, that's when we lose track of who we are. Because now, instead of just seeing the simple beingness of me, blended in with everything, unified in with everything, there's me and there's all these gods. There's me and there's your God. There's me and there's you. There's me and there's the tree. There's me and there's a rock. All of a sudden, I'm divided from reality. So, dang, that was all Moses's fault, right? I mean, actually, it was kind of the evolution of thought that was going on at the time, because by the time Moses came into being, societies were already very divided. We can tell for sure because of the way that women were invisibilized, right? Like, why do we have a story about Moses? Why don't we have a story about, let's see, what would the female Moses be? Mosey. Why don't we have a story about Mosey? Instead, we have this big bearded guy who marches up, gets the rock stone tablets. Here's the rules. This division at that time became a bigger division. Look at, maybe the way to think of it is that when this story came in and started being like this dominant story, it was so compelling that it was a lot harder to get over than the idea that there was all these crazy gods floating around in the sky doing whatever they do. But you don't have to go very far back into human history before that to a place where there was no concept of God at all. There was just our relationship with everything. And how do we know this? Because it was never written down, right? We know this because just by the freak of luck, by the fact that the planet is so big that these god societies were not able to conquer and destroy everyone. And that's literally what they did. I mean, what is the story of the Bible? It's just the story of battle after battle after battle until we get, like if you're Jewish, you only have the Old Testament. If you're Christian, then you have the New Testament. If you're Muslim, I believe, you have the Old Testament and then you have the Quran that comes in. And maybe the New Testament too. But there's this mark, boom, Jesus, right? The year 0. Actually, it's the year of the Romans taking over. After that, what's history about? Wars and wars and wars and wars and conquerors. And we know as a fact that the history that we learn today is only the history of the victors. It's only the history of the people who won. It's not the history of full humanity. It doesn't include what was there before. So Moses is just a very good example of the division in our thinking that causes us to feel divided from the world. And it's a really good kind of point. Like if you want to bring yourself back to a time when humans were living naturally on the planet and you're not indigenous, then that's about as far as you got to go. You got to go about back that far until you can find people who were living naturally within tribes. We can't find it in any written book because the natural human being cannot and never was written down. As soon as you could start writing things, that's only because division of thinking had already started. So, what does this mean for us as non-duality people? I don't want to say non-duality seekers because non-duality is not a path. It is a technique to undo your mind so that you don't need a path. So what does all this have to do for us as non-duality people? Well, if you allow these deep, deep stories to unravel in your mind, and it's not like you got to just completely toss them away, in some deep meditative state. Just simply look at it and go, wait a minute. What's really being told to us in this story? Has this story really been a useful story for humanity? What did it lead to? Where did it come from? A really good question is, what did this story mean for women? Because the second you start dividing women from humanity, men are people and women are like, I don't know, what are we? The second we start having these male hierarchies, we have division because we don't have the interplay between male and female that keeps things in balance. So the second we have hierarchy societies, we have a society that's out of balance. I would assume that if you had a hierarchy that was all women and men were all slaves, that you would have just as bad of a division. You just got to assume that. We don't really have any examples of it, so we don't know for sure. Maybe it's just easier for guys to get a hierarchy going. They sure did a good job of it, right? So what if it's all Moses's fault? And think about what it was he did. So first of all, he frees all the Jews, right? And then he's going along and they just keep worshiping all their gods because they needed, their golden calf and all that stuff. Moses hikes up the mountain and sees God and talks to God, the burning bush, right? And God gives him the tablets, the 10 Commandments. And he comes down and he gives the commandments to all the Jews. And boom, they're immediately harmoniously all believing in one God. No. We know from the story that it was a really hard transition for this tribe of people to switch from a multiplicity of gods to just one God. And if you kind of read the stories, the only way it really happened was because their one God kept winning battles. It's the story of who wins the battles is the history that we have today. So there's no way that we can completely unravel this story by replacing it with a different story, because the different story doesn't exist. And that, again, is the beauty of non-duality. Non-duality doesn't tell us to look inside, find all the things that we are not, and replace them with something else. It's like, no, go deep and deep and deep and deep until you are comfortable being in that nothingness, that place that the mind can't define things. And when you do that, what happens? Well, all of a sudden you're at a place where you can't define who you are anymore. And so the projection has to stop. And you realize, oh, I'm me. There's a thing in Zen called the backward step. You step back into yourself. Now you're just a person. Who are you without the story of Moses? Who are you without any of these stories of us? And again, this takes us back to non-duality, because non-duality is, in essence, talking about the intertwined unity of everything. So you can't really find who am I without finding out who are we, right? You can't find out who am I without finding out what is the earth? Where exactly am I standing? What exact moment of time am I in? I'm right here. I'm right now. Backward step of Zen. I am that, as Nisargadatta says. I think it's easier to take this backward step into yourself if we're willing to, with lots of humor and lightness of feeling, dismantle all these stories of what we think a human being is. This is how we wake up. And then without holding firmly to all these stories. The stories are still there, right? All the stories are still there. I mean, we can sit and have Nero playing his fiddle as Rome burned. We know these stories, right? Santa Claus, we know that story, right? But if we can uh, lightly and with humor remove ourselves from that, as that is not defining who you are, that is not defining who I am, now we can start coming together in a way where everyone is completely responsible for what they do because we're not projected out any longer. And this is the way we can start repairing the damage that we have collectively done here on the planet. It requires really, really a lot of awake people. And most important, it requires you being there. Rumi, out beyond all feelings of right and wrong, there is a field. I'll meet you there.